The knock came hard and deliberate against 6-meter-tall glass doors, the kind of doors that don't belong to a man who builds things with his hands. 3 sharp strikes, then silence, then 3 more, as if whoever stood on the other side had already decided the person inside owed them an explanation. Ethan Walker set down his pencil on the temporary work table he'd built from sawhorses and a sheet of plywood, brushed a curl of wood shaving from his sleeve, and walked across the marble foyer of a home that had cost him $34 million to purchase and would cost considerably more before he was finished with it. He opened the door himself. He always did. There was no housekeeper yet, no assistant, no one stationed at the entrance to manage the impression he made on the world. Ethan Walker had never been interested in managing impressions. He was interested in work, and the work was inside, and anyone who needed to reach him could knock. Standing on the stone steps of what would eventually become one of the most architecturally restored estates in Aspen Ridge Summit were 3 people: a uniformed security guard whose name Ethan didn't yet know, a man in a pressed polo shirt holding a clipboard, and, positioned slightly ahead of the other 2 in the manner of someone who had long since stopped questioning whether she had the right to stand at the front of any situation, Victoria Sterling. She was the president of the Aspen Ridge Summit Homeowners Association, a fact she conveyed less through introduction and more through posture, through the particular quality of stillness that comes from inhabiting authority for long enough that it stops feeling like something you perform and starts feeling like something you simply are. She wore a white wool coat that had never once encountered a construction site. Her hair was the kind of perfectly maintained that requires a standing appointment and a practitioner who understands that the goal is to appear effortless. She had the bearing of someone who had spent many years in rooms where her presence was expected and her authority was not questioned. And she brought that bearing to the stone steps of a house she had never visited, in front of a door she had no right to knock on, and she deployed it now against a man she had already decided did not belong here. She looked at Ethan Walker at his dusty work boots, his canvas jacket with its pockets full of measuring tape and chalk lines, his flannel shirt worn thin at one elbow, and the pencil still tucked behind his ear, the way certain people look at something unexpected in a place they believe belongs only to them. "Excuse me," she said. "Can I help you?" Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he said, "I don't think so." It was not the answer she expected. People in Ethan's position, or rather, in what she had decided was his position, did not answer dismissively. They answered apologetically, or not at all, or with the reflexive courtesy of someone conscious of their place. The fact that he had answered the way he had calmly, with 3 words, and without looking away, created a small and unfamiliar friction in her understanding of the situation. She would ignore the friction. She was practiced at ignoring it. Nothing that followed would be what she had prepared for. Ethan Marcus Walker had turned 42 the previous November, and if you were the kind of person who paid attention to the wrong details, you would miss everything important about him. He drove a Ford F-150 that had 211,000 miles on it, a crack running through the lower corner of the passenger side windshield, and a bed that permanently smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. He wore clothes that were purchased for function and washed until they faded. He had calluses on both hands that no amount of money had softened, because Ethan Walker had never once thought of money as a reason to stop using his hands. He had grown up in Billings, Montana, the son of a Finnish carpenter who believed that the quality of a man's work was the only biography that mattered. Saturday mornings in his father's shop smelled of sawdust and tung oil, and Ethan had learned to read a level before he could read cursive. By the time he was 16, he could read a blueprint faster than most adults could read a newspaper, and he understood the relationship between a structural drawing and the physical reality it described with a clarity that most people who dealt in buildings never fully achieved. By 22, he was running crews on commercial builds across 3 states. By 30, he had started buying distressed properties, the kind that sat on the market too long because their problems were visible and their potential was not renovating them himself and selling them for the price that patience and skill had earned. By 35, he had learned which problems to look for before he bought. By 38, he had structured his holdings through a series of trusts and limited liability entities that kept his name pleasantly invisible on any document a casual observer might encounter. He had not done this to hide. He had done it because privacy, in his experience, was the most undervalued luxury available to a person of means. When you were known to be wealthy, people adjusted everything they said and did in your presence. They became careful, or performative, or calculating, or some mixture of all 3. Contractors sharpened their bids. Neighbors recalibrated their friendliness. Institutions found reasons to extend courtesies. All of it was noise. The trust structure filtered it. What remained was the work itself, and the work was all Ethan had ever really wanted. The Aspen Ridge Summit property, a 4,700 square meter estate set against a ridgeline of the Rocky Mountains, with original stonework dating to the 1940s and a main house that had spent the last 11 years in slow architectural decay, had come to him through a foreclosure auction. The purchase had been executed entirely through the Walker Family Trust. No one in Aspen Ridge Summit, including Victoria Sterling and every member of her Homeowners Association board, had ever seen Ethan Walker's face in connection with the transaction. They knew only that the abandoned estate at the end of Ridgeline Drive had been sold, that permits had been pulled, and that construction vehicles had begun arriving in the pre-dawn hours of a Tuesday in early October. What they had seen, in the week since, was a heavily used pickup truck coming and going at unusual hours, a rotating collection of tradespeople, and a lean man in work clothes who appeared to be supervising the entire operation from the interior of the house. He carried no visible authority. He gave no indication that he was anything other than the most senior person on a job site. He ate lunch from a thermos on the stone steps of the main entrance. He spoke with the tradespeople in the language of someone who understood every task being performed. None of this, in Victoria Sterling's assessment, added up to a property owner. It added up to a foreman at best, possibly a general contractor, certainly not someone whose name would appear on any deed registered in this neighborhood. She had watched from the road on multiple occasions, driving slowly past the property line, noting the construction vehicles, cataloging the comings and goings with the focused attention of someone who has appointed herself the custodian of a community's character. She had taken note of the truck. She had taken note of the man. She had consulted with the man on her left, Marcus Webb, the HOA's Architectural Review Committee chair, who wore the expression of someone who has agreed to something and is now in the process of determining whether he agrees with it, and together they had concluded that something needed to be done. The security guard, Kevin Turner, had been summoned from the gatehouse with a brief phone call that explained nothing of the situation he was being walked into, and so the three of them had arrived at Ethan's door on a Wednesday morning at 9:47, prepared to address what Victoria had already decided, without evidence, was an unauthorized occupation. "We're here on behalf of the Aspen Ridge Summit Homeowners Association," Victoria said, stepping forward slightly, as though Ethan had not quite understood who she was. "There have been concerns raised about the activity at this property, and we need to speak with the owner." "You're speaking with him," Ethan said. A pause, not long, but long enough to mean something. The October light came in flat across the mountain and caught the glass doors at an angle that turned them momentarily opaque, and in that moment of blinded gold, the three of them stood on the stone steps with the muffled sound of construction machinery behind them, and the specific quality of silence that follows when something has not gone according to plan. Victoria's expression did not change in any overt way. She had too much practice for that, but something in her eyes recalibrated, a small interior adjustment, like a compass needle correcting for magnetic interference. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Ethan. "We understand there's renovation work underway," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "Our records indicate the property was recently transferred through a trust structure, and we haven't been able to confirm the identity of the beneficial owner. Until that's established, HOA policy requires that non-essential access be restricted." She produced a folded document from inside her coat and held it out. "This is a temporary access limitation notice. It requires any non-verified personnel to vacate the premises pending ownership confirmation." Ethan did not reach for the document. He looked at it for a moment the way a man looks at something he finds mildly interesting but does not intend to take seriously, the kind of look that contains no hostility and no anxiety, only a clear-eyed assessment of what is being offered and whether it deserves to be treated as real. "What's the legal basis for that?" he asked. "Which specific clause in the CC&Rs gives the HOA authority to remove a person from a private residence?" Victoria did not answer the question directly. She said that the HOA had responsibility for community standards and security protocols. She said that the situation was irregular. She said that the process existed for the protection of all residents. What she did not do was cite a specific provision, a section number, or a line of text from any governing document, because there was no such provision. There was, in fact, no clause in the Aspen Ridge Summit CC&Rs that gave the Homeowners Association the authority to remove a person from a private home on the basis of not appearing sufficiently wealthy. Ethan listened to all of it. He stood in the doorway of his $34 million home in his sawdust-covered jacket and his worn boots, and he listened without interrupting, without raising his voice, without the kind of theatrical outrage that the moment might have seemed to invite. He was a man who had learned, over the course of a life spent building things and acquiring things and watching people misread him, that patience was frequently the most devastating response available. When she was finished, he asked again, "Which clause?" Victoria straightened, her chin lifted, and then she said the thing she would spend the following weeks wishing she could take back. "Sir, I'm asking you to leave this property until the owner can be properly verified. If you refuse, we will involve the county sheriff's office." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The Rocky Mountain light was cold and flat against the stone facade of the house behind him. Somewhere inside, a crew member was running a sander over a section of original hardwood flooring, and the low mechanical hum of it drifted out through the open door. "You're ordering me to leave my own home," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Victoria said. "I am." He stepped back and held the door open. "Then come in." It was an invitation that contained its own architecture. He did not say it with warmth. He did not say it with hostility. He said it with the exact calibration of a man who has assessed a situation, understood what it requires, and is prepared to let the situation proceed at whatever pace it chooses to proceed. The door swung wide on its heavy bronze hardware he had sourced from a salvage operation in Denver, original to the period of the house, and the mountain light fell across the threshold and into the foyer, and Ethan Walker stepped aside and waited. What happened in the next several minutes was not what Victoria Sterling had planned. She had expected argument, or compliance, or the kind of defensive bluster she had encountered from contractors and tradespeople in the past. She had not expected to be invited inside. She had not expected the calm. She stepped across the threshold with Marcus and Kevin behind her, and immediately the scale of the interior space, the soaring ceilings, the original stone fireplace that ran floor to ceiling on the north wall, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out across the ridge arranged itself around her in a way that made her feel, for just a moment, slightly less certain of everything she had walked in believing. Ethan led them to the center of the main hall, where the temporary work table sat amid the organized materials of a serious renovation architect's drawings pinned flat, material samples arranged in careful rows, a laptop open to project management software, and stacked beside the table, a set of manila folders that would not have looked out of place in a real estate attorney's office. "Kevin," Ethan said, turning to the security guard, "I want you to check the gate access log. Pull up this morning's entry for this address." Kevin Turner was 29 years old, 2 years into his job at the Aspen Ridge Summit Gatehouse, and he had the expression of a man who had recently understood that he was standing somewhere he did not want to be. The morning had begun as an ordinary Wednesday. It was not going to end as one. He looked at Victoria. She gave a small nod, the nod of someone who expects the data to confirm what she has already concluded. He pulled out his access device and scrolled through the log. "Entry at 5:41 a.m., Kevin said quietly. "Primary access code." "Who was that code assigned to?" Ethan asked. Kevin looked at his device. He scrolled. He looked again. The color of the moment shifted the way color shifts when a cloud moves across the sun. "Primary owner account," Kevin said. He did not look up. The clipboard in Marcus Webb's hands had stopped moving. Whatever he had been preparing to write notes on unauthorized personnel, probably, or the language of a formal complaint, he was not writing it. The pen rested against the board at an angle that suggested it had been forgotten. Victoria said nothing. She was looking at Kevin's device with the expression of a person who has placed a step on ground they were certain would hold and felt it give. It was working very hard to remain composed, that expression. It was not entirely succeeding. "The system logged me as the primary account holder when I entered this morning," Ethan said, "because I am the primary account holder. I set up this property's gate registration myself 4 weeks ago when I took possession of the title. I was given the primary owner credentials because the title is in my name." He paused. "Or rather, in the name of my trust, which exists for my benefit, which makes me the owner." Victoria pivoted. She did it smoothly, and it was almost impressive the way she moved from one line of reasoning to another without pausing to acknowledge that the first had collapsed entirely beneath her. "The access code," she said, "could have been shared with a contractor. The primary account could have been registered in error. These things happened. She would need to see documentation." "Of course," Ethan said. He walked to the table and opened one of the manila folders. What he laid out on the plywood surface was not a single document, but a systematic record of ownership assembled with the kind of precision that comes from a man who has closed several hundred real estate transactions and understands exactly which papers matter and exactly how they need to be organized. There was the closing statement, 112 pages, detailing the acquisition of the property through the Walker Family Trust. There was the trust certificate establishing Ethan Marcus Walker as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. There was the recorded deed, bearing the official seal of the county recorder's office. There was the cadastral survey, with the property boundaries drawn in the clean, unambiguous language of legal description. There were the renovation permits, each of them issued in the name of the Walker Family Trust, each of them signed off by the appropriate municipal offices. And there was the property insurance binder, naming Ethan Walker as the insured party on a policy valued at $41 million. Every document said the same thing. Every document had said the same thing since the morning of the closing, and every document would continue saying the same thing regardless of what anyone assumed when they looked at the man standing beside the plywood table in a flannel shirt. Ethan stood to one side and let Victoria read. He did not hover. He did not point things out. He had long ago learned that documents make better arguments than people, and he had no intention of diluting theirs. She picked up the deed. She set it down. She looked at the trust certificate. She set it down. She looked at the permits. She did not speak for a period of time that felt longer than it was. When she finally spoke, she did not apologize. Later, Ethan would reflect that this was perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire episode. Not the original confrontation, not the gate log, but this. The moment when a person had been shown, in unambiguous documentary language, and that they were wrong about every single thing they had assumed, and they responded not with acknowledgement but with redirection. Victoria Sterling said that the paperwork appeared to be in order. She said that nevertheless, the HOA had remaining concerns about the volume of construction activity. She said that vehicles of a certain type, she gestured vaguely toward the window, in the direction of Ethan's truck, were inconsistent with the community's standards. She said that the number of tradespeople accessing the property on a daily basis had raised questions about noise compliance. She said all of this without once saying, "I was wrong. I made an assumption based on the way you look, and I was wrong." Ethan turned to face the camera mounted in the upper corner of the hallway, one of 7 he had installed during the first week of renovation, each of them networked to a cloud storage system that had been running continuously since the day he moved in. He had installed them for the renovation project, to monitor work quality and track materials. They had recorded everything that had happened in the past 45 minutes. "You came into my house," he said quietly, "and you told me to leave. Not because you had evidence of a problem, not because you had a legal basis, because I didn't look like what you expected the owner of this house to look like." Victoria's expression tightened. "That is not what this was. The record will reflect what it was," Ethan said. He said it without raising his voice, without the theatrical weight that the moment might have invited. It was a statement of fact about a process he had already decided to set in motion. He picked up his phone and called Amanda Brooks. Amanda Brooks had been a real estate and property law attorney for 19 years, and she had represented Ethan Walker through 14 transactions in 4 states. She operated out of a Denver office on the 14th floor of a building that looked east toward the plains, and she had the quality of people who spend their professional lives reading documents carefully, a precise attention to language, a habit of pausing before speaking that some people found unsettling, and a complete absence of theatrical emphasis. She did not raise her voice. She did not underline things for effect. She simply stated what was true with the confidence of someone who has checked. He gave her a brief summary of the morning's events, while Victoria and Marcus stood nearby close enough to hear the shape of the conversation, if not the words, and he could hear in the quality of Amanda's silence on the other end of the call the particular attention of a lawyer who has just identified something worth pursuing. It was not an excited silence. It was the silence of a person taking accurate measurements. "Send me everything," she said. "All the footage, all the gate logs, and send me the full cadastral survey for the property and the surrounding parcels." It was the last part of that instruction, the surrounding parcels, that would prove to matter most. Ethan did not immediately know why Amanda had asked for the broader survey. He assumed it was thoroughness. He sent the files that afternoon, the footage from all 7 cameras, time-stamped and organized by Ethan himself, into a clearly labeled archive, along with the complete gate access log for the property, and returned to supervising the installation of reclaimed oak flooring in the east wing of the house. He spent the following 2 days in the particular focused quiet that renovation work requires, a state of attention that is not quite meditation but has some of the same properties. The mind narrows to what is directly in front of it, and everything peripheral becomes, temporarily, less important than whether the board is level. He did not think much about Victoria Sterling. He had encountered her type before, not the specific person, but the specific category of certainty, the kind that errors in judgment do not dent so much as briefly rearrange. He had been assessed incorrectly many times in his life, by many kinds of people, and his general response was to continue being correct in ways that eventually became impossible to ignore. Amanda called him on the third day. "I need you to look at something," she said. "Pull up the survey on your laptop. I'm going to walk you through the boundary lines, all of them." What Amanda had found, in the process of mapping the legal descriptions against satellite imagery and the recorded plat of Aspen Ridge Summit, was a discrepancy that had apparently existed for some time without anyone paying particularly close attention to it. The main entrance road of Aspen Ridge Summit, the curving, well-maintained drive that led from the county highway to the community gatehouse, and from the gatehouse through the Vong Sway to the residential streets beyond, crossed a strip of land approximately 12 meters wide and 48 meters long before it reached the gatehouse itself. That strip of land was not part of the HOA's common area. It was not part of any HOA-owned parcel. According to the legal description in the county recorder's records, it was part of the parcel that had, until recently, formed the abandoned estate at the end of Ridgeline Drive. It was part of Ethan Walker's property. The geometry of this was, in retrospect, almost elegant in its irony. The woman who had entered Ethan's home and demanded he leave had set in motion the process that would reveal her organization had been trespassing on his land for a year and a half. The inquiry she had forced the attorney call, the document review, the cadastral survey request had illuminated a legal deficiency that would never have come to anyone's attention had Victoria Sterling simply read the gate log before knocking. The easement that had historically authorized the road's use of that strip had been a recorded agreement between the previous owner of the estate and the HOA, executed 23 years earlier and renewable every 5 years. The most recent renewal had been due 18 months ago. It had not been renewed. There was no record of any communication between the HOA and the estate's previous owner about the expiration, and in any case, the previous owner had been in default for several years before Ethan purchased the property, making the question of who should have been communicating with whom somewhat academic. The practical result was straightforward. The Aspen Ridge Summit Homeowners Association had been operating its primary entrance road across a strip of Ethan Walker's land for a year and a half without any legal authorization to do so. Every resident who had driven through that gate, every delivery truck, every contractor vehicle, every car carrying groceries or guests or Victoria Sterling herself to whatever it was Victoria Sterling attended on the other side of those mountains, had been crossing Ethan Walker's property. Amanda sent the legal notice on a Friday morning. It was a preservation demand, formally requiring the HOA, its management company, its security contractor, and every member of the board of directors to preserve and retain all electronic communication, access logs, incident reports, camera footage, and internal documents relating to the events of the Wednesday morning in question. The notice also attached, as an exhibit, the relevant portions of the cadastral survey, with the expired easement highlighted in a color that left very little to the imagination. By Friday afternoon, the HOA's management company had called Amanda's office. The conversation, Amanda reported to Ethan in a brief summary, had been cordial in the strained way of conversations where one party is aware they are in a weak position and is trying to determine how weak before committing to a tone. By Friday evening, the security contractor, the firm that employed Kevin Turner and the other guards who staffed the Aspen Ridge Summit Gatehouse, had also called, and their conversation had been somewhat less cordial, carrying the particular urgency of an organization that has just understood it may have participated in something legally actionable. By Saturday morning, 3 separate board members, not Victoria, but 3 others, people who had attended the HOA's monthly meetings for years without imagining they might one day face a preservation demand, had sent emails to Ethan's attorney expressing, in varying degrees of formality, their personal regret about the incident and their desire to resolve things amicably. Victoria Sterling did not call. Victoria Sterling did not write. Victoria Sterling, as far as anyone could observe, had taken the position that silence was the most defensible posture available to her, and she was maintaining it with the same certainty with which she had maintained everything else. Meanwhile, in Aspen Ridge Summit, The news of the expired easement moved through the community in the particular way that consequential information moves through a small community of people who have invested heavily in a belief that their arrangements are permanent. It moved first through the board members, who had received Amanda's notice, then to their spouses, then to the neighbors those spouses spoke with, and within 48 hours it had reached the kind of critical mass where people were discussing it in parking lots and on the well-maintained walking paths of the development, with the particular urgency of people who have recently understood that something they relied upon without thinking about it has become uncertain. Within 72 hours of Amanda's notice being received, there was not a resident in Aspen Ridge Summit who did not understand that the road they drove every day, the road their children walked to the bus stop on, the road their housekeepers and plumbers and electricians arrived on, the road their grocery deliveries came down, the road every one of them had used without a second thought, since the day they moved in, did not legally belong to the HOA, and had not legally belonged to them for a year and a half. The people who came to Ethan's door in the days that followed were different from the people who had stood outside it a week earlier. They were polite in the effortful way that people are polite. When they have recently become aware of a vulnerability, they had not previously identified a politeness that has urgency underneath it, that is performing friendliness, while actually conducting an assessment. They arrived individually and in pairs, at various hours, always with the appearance of people who have chosen a casual tone in order to discuss something they do not find casual at all. A retired couple from the house across the road, he was a former federal judge, which Ethan noted with quiet amusement, since judges tend to understand property law better than most, arrived on a Sunday afternoon and spent 20 minutes being very pleasant before arriving at the topic they had come to discuss. A man named Richard Calloway, who sat on the HOA's finance committee, came on Monday morning and had the particular look of someone trying to assess a situation from all angles simultaneously, calculating costs and outcomes, the way people do when they are aware that someone else now holds a variable in an equation that affects them. A woman named Patricia Norwood arrived Tuesday at noon, explained that she had 3 young children, drove through that gate twice a day to reach the school where 2 of them were enrolled, and would very much appreciate knowing how this was going to be resolved. She said it without accusation, which Ethan respected. Ethan was straightforward with all of them. He told them he had no intention of blocking the road. He told them he was not interested in creating a hardship for the people who lived here, who had purchased their homes in good faith and had no part in what had happened on the Wednesday morning in question. He told them what he wanted: a properly executed easement agreement, drafted to current legal standards and reviewed by both parties' counsel, accompanied by appropriate liability insurance that named the Walker Family Trust as an additional insured party, and a fair use fee that reflected the commercial benefit the road access provided to a community of properties at this price point. He had had Amanda prepare a preliminary fee analysis. It was reasonable. He showed it to Richard Calloway, who studied it for several minutes without speaking and then said it seemed fair. He told them all that these were not punitive demands. They were the terms that should have been in place all along, and would have been if anyone at the HOA had been paying sufficient attention to their own governing documents in the year and a half since the previous agreement lapsed. He did not tell them that the woman who had walked into his house and ordered him to leave was the reason any of this had come to his attention in the first place. He thought they could probably figure that part out themselves. The emergency board meeting was called for the following Tuesday evening. Amanda Brooks joined by video from her office, her face calm and precise in the conference room screen. Victoria was present in person, seated at the end of the table, in the same white wool coat she had worn the week before, with the expression of a person who has made the strategic decision to be physically present while minimizing the degree to which they are engaged. Marcus Webb sat with his clipboard. 4 other board members occupied the remaining seats, none of them looking at Victoria with particular warmth. The HOA's own attorney, a man named Douglas Hatch, who had the appearance of someone who had not anticipated spending his Tuesday this way, walked through the situation methodically. The expired easement, the preservation demand, the footage from Ethan's interior cameras showing the events of Wednesday morning in clear and time-stamped detail, the gate log confirming primary owner access, the complete ownership documentation. Then Amanda took over the screen. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She displayed the cadastral survey on the screen, a clean technical document, the kind of thing that exists entirely outside the domain of interpretation, and she walked the board through the boundary lines, the way you walk someone through a set of facts that explain themselves, not arguing, not persuading, simply tracing the lines that had always been there for anyone who had chosen to look. Here is where the HOA's property ends. Here is where the road continues. Here is the strip in between. Here is what the easement agreement said. Here is the date it was executed. Here is the renewal period it specified. Here is when it expired. Here is the date of the last entry in the road use log. Here is the mathematical relationship between those two dates. And here, finally, is what the law requires in the absence of a valid easement, which is to say, an agreement with the person who owns the land, on that person's terms, at that person's discretion. The room was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people who have organized their sense of authority around a set of assumptions are confronted with the specific dimensions of what those assumptions have cost them. Several board members looked at the survey on the screen. Several looked at their hands. One looked at Victoria, but Victoria was looking at the table. After Douglas Hatch confirmed, in the measured and slightly pained language of an attorney confirming something he wished he could qualify differently, that Amanda's legal analysis was correct in all material respects, the easement had lapsed, the road use was unauthorized, and the events of the Wednesday morning had no defensible legal basis, the board voted. There was not much deliberation. The facts had been laid out in a sequence that did not admit of alternative conclusions, and the board members who had received emails from their neighbors about the road, who had driven through the gate that morning with the specific self-consciousness of people who now knew what they were driving over, had made their decisions before the vote was called. The count was 5-1 to suspend Victoria Sterling's authority to direct security personnel to take any action regarding a private property matter without prior written approval from a quorum of the board. The one dissenting vote was cast by Marcus Webb, possibly out of loyalty, possibly because he had attended enough HOA meetings to find the precedent troubling, possibly out of some other calculation that the outcome of the vote rendered entirely irrelevant. The formal letter arrived at Ethan's attorney's office on Thursday of the following week, inside an envelope with the Aspen Ridge Summit Homeowners Association seal, embossed in gold at the upper left corner, a detail that struck Amanda as either oblivious to irony or deeply committed to it. It was printed on HOA letterhead and signed by the board chair in the absence of the president, who had tendered a temporary leave of administrative duties pending the resolution of ongoing matters. The phrasing was the careful, bureaucratic language of an institution managing a wound it would prefer to regard as a paperwork issue. The letter confirmed, in writing, that Ethan Marcus Walker, as trustee of the Walker Family Trust, was the sole legal owner of the property at Ridgeline Drive. It confirmed that the events of the previous Wednesday had been handled incorrectly and without legal basis. It confirmed that the HOA rescinded any and all access limitation notices issued in connection with that property. And it confirmed that the board had approved the engagement of legal counsel to negotiate a new easement agreement on terms acceptable to the Walker Family Trust. The letter did not contain the words "we were wrong." It contained something more bureaucratic and less human, which was perhaps the best that could be expected from an institution that had constructed its identity around the idea that it was never wrong. Ethan read it once, set it aside, and went back to work. By mid-November, the reclaimed oak floors in the east wing were finished 2,000 square feet of wide plank white oak that had come from a demolished factory building in Pennsylvania and had been stored in a climate-controlled facility in Denver for 11 months before Ethan found them. They were the right age and the right color, and their grain had the kind of character that cannot be manufactured, only waited for. By the end of the month, the original stone fireplace had been repointed with period-appropriate mortar, a blend Ethan had worked out with a masonry specialist over 3 consultations and cleaned back to its original color, which turned out to be a deep, warm gray that made the whole north wall of the main hall look as though it had always been exactly what it was supposed to be, because it had. The architects had finished their drawings for the south wing renovation, which would require the dismantling and careful reconstruction of the original timber frame, a process that would take most of the winter, and Ethan had spent several evenings at the work table reviewing material selections for the spring exterior work, comparing stone samples against photographs of the original construction. The new easement agreement was executed in the 3rd week of November, following 2 weeks of negotiation between Amanda Brooks and Douglas Hatch. The terms were reasonable. They were the terms Ethan had described to Patricia Norwood and Richard Calloway and the retired couple from across the road: a properly drafted legal instrument, appropriate insurance, a fair annual fee, nothing punitive, nothing theatrical, just the correct arrangement that should have existed all along. The gate at Aspen Ridge Summit continued to function exactly as it always had. Cars passed through it every morning and every evening. Children walked past it to the bus stop. Delivery trucks rolled through without incident. The security guard in the gatehouse, Kevin Turner, who had quietly submitted a written account of the Wednesday morning events to the board at Amanda's request, went about his work with the added awareness that the strip of pavement beneath the front wheels of every vehicle he waved through was, in a very specific legal sense, someone else's land used by permission. The renovation continued into winter without interruption, because Ethan Walker did not interrupt things unnecessarily. The legal matters were in Amanda's hands. The documentation was complete. The outcome, he was reasonably certain, was already determined by a set of facts that had been determined long before any of this began. He returned to the work the way he always returned to the work, completely. The snow came early to the ridge that year. It came in the first week of December, heavy and quiet in the way that mountain snow announces itself not with wind, but with a particular muffling of sound, a stillness that descends before the first flake and deepens as they accumulate. It covered the stone steps of the estate on Ridgeline Drive in a smooth, unbroken layer that erased the bootprints of the tradespeople who had been in and out all week. It piled in drifts against the restored stone walls, finding the same channels and corners that Ethan imagined it had found for the 80 years before the house was abandoned, and it settled on the peaks beyond the windows of the main hall in a way that made the mountains look like something from before the world had names for things ancient and indifferent, and very clear about where the light fell and where the shadow began. Ethan stood at the glass one morning with a mug of coffee and watched it come down, and he thought not for the first time since October, but not with any particular drama either, the way you think about something that has resolved itself and left a useful residue of understanding about the strange geometry of how assumptions accumulate. How a person sees a truck in a driveway and decides they know everything important about the owner of the truck. How certainty, and in people of a certain disposition, arrives fully formed and requires no evidence, only confirmation. How the machinery of that certainty, the formal notices, the authority figures summoned in from their gatehouse posts, the orders issued to people standing in their own homes, can feel so absolute right up to the moment it meets a set of facts and dissolves. He thought about what Victoria Sterling had seen when she looked at him in the doorway of his house on that Wednesday morning. And he thought about what she had not seen. The 20 years of work behind the calluses on his hands, the apprenticeship under his father, the first property bought with money saved across 3 years of crew work, the calculations done in motel rooms after 12-hour days on construction sites, the slow accumulation of judgment that comes only from having been wrong in recoverable ways a sufficient number of times. She had not seen the properties bought and rebuilt and sold across 4 states. She had not seen the trust documents and title searches and closing statements filed in county recorder offices from Montana to Colorado. She had not seen the specific satisfaction, quiet, internal, not requiring an audience, of knowing that everything he owned he had understood before he purchased it and improved before he sold it, and that the one he had decided to keep, this one, at the end of the ridge, with its original stonework and its damaged floors and its history of having been something remarkable once, and his conviction that it could be again, was the truest expression of everything he had learned to value. She had seen a man who didn't look like the owner of a $34 million house, and she had acted on that assessment with complete confidence in its accuracy. He did not think she had done it because she was a cruel person. Exactly. Cruelty requires intention, and he suspected that Victoria Sterling, standing on those steps with her white coat and her preservation notice, had not intended anything other than the maintenance of what she understood as order. She had sorted, and the sorting had felt to her like judgment, like discernment, even because it had been operating beneath the level of examination for long enough that it no longer felt like a choice. He thought she had done it because she had spent long enough in a world that sorted people by appearance and credential and the quality of their vehicles, by the cut of a coat and the absence of sawdust, that the sorting had become automatic, invisible to herself, and fully visible to anyone it was applied to. That invisibility was the thing. The sorting that its practitioner cannot see is the sorting that does the most damage, because it carries the absolute conviction of something that has never been questioned. He thought that was its own kind of limitation, the way any unexamined assumption is a limitation. It closes off the territory it touches, makes it smaller, reduces it to the size of what was expected rather than what exists, and forecloses all the inconvenient possibilities that reality keeps generating. The floor in the east wing was beautiful. The stone fireplace glowed at night when they tested the draw. The south wing plans were good. The house was becoming, slowly and correctly, what it had been designed to be. That was the work. That was what mattered. The gate at the bottom of Ridgeline Drive operated under a valid legal agreement. The road through the community was used by all its residents on the terms that had been negotiated. The insurance was in place. The fee was paid quarterly to the Walker Family Trust by a community association that now had very clear documentation of whose land lay beneath its primary entrance. No one in Aspen Ridge Summit was going to forget how that arrangement had come to be renegotiated. Not the board members who had voted at the emergency meeting, not Richard Calloway or Patricia Norwood or the retired couple from across the road, not Kevin Turner, who had looked at his access device and read 2 words that changed the shape of a Wednesday morning, primary owner, not Marcus Webb, who had driven through that gate every day for 9 years and had never once thought about who owned the 12 meters of land beneath the entrance road, and not Victoria Sterling, wherever her leave of administrative duties had taken her, who had knocked 3 times on a 6-meter glass door on a cold October morning because she saw a man in work boots standing in a house she had decided could not be his, and had discovered, in the particular way that certainty discovers it has been wrong, that the documents had always told a different story. Power is not carried in a title. It is not announced by the make of the vehicle in the driveway, or the brand on the jacket, or the quality of the shoes, or any of the other visible signals that certain people have trained themselves to read as measures of standing. It does not require performance, or posture, or the deliberate creation of an impression, or the ability to make other people feel that they do not belong in the places where they stand. Those things, the performance, the posture, the theater of authority, are what power looks like when it is uncertain of itself, when it needs the confirmation of other people's deference to remain stable. Real power is quieter than that and considerably more patient. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need to be believed in by strangers. It exists in documents and recorded deeds and the clean precision of legal descriptions, and it waits in the gap between what is assumed and what is true, accumulating without effort until the moment someone decides to produce the paperwork. And then it does not argue. It simply becomes visible. It was always there. Ethan Walker finished his coffee, set the mug on the plywood table next to the architect's drawings, and went back to work. The south wing plans were open in front of him. The morning light was coming in at its winter angle across the stone of the north wall, and the house, his house, the one with its name on the deed and its trust certificate and its $41 million insurance policy, was quiet around him in the particular way that very large, very old buildings are quiet, not empty, but settled, patient with itself, already having been many things, and content to become the next one.